All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and everyone else out there. Today we're going to be looking at the radicalization of the French Revolution. After King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were both executed at the hands of the Revolutionary National Convention, we see that the revolution is going to transform from one based on reform to one based on violence and suppression. And that is the period of time where we're going to see the guillotines come out, we're going to see the mass deaths, etc. So that's what we plan to get into today. Before we do that, I want to go back and revisit Marie Antoinette now that she's dead in our story. Marie Antoinette, there is another side to her, and that is the fact she was a very devoted mother to her four children. She doted on them. She spent time with them. Whenever possible, she and the kids would retreat to a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles, where she would wear regular clothes and play games with the kids. She even cooked for them. So she had two sides to herself, and I want to give her credit for the one. Unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, she did have a hard life. Her youngest daughter, Sophie, died from complications of premature birth at the age of 11 months old. 3 years later, her son, Louis Joseph, the oldest son and heir to the king, died of tuberculosis at the age of 7. That was only 1 week before the storming of the Bastille. So she is dealing with the grief of losing a child as she's being chased through the palace by these women from the March of Versailles. 1793, when King Louis is executed, Marie is executed 9 months later. And then, unfortunately, in 1795, Louis Charles, her son, was imprisoned and separated from his mom and his sister. Louis Charles is going to be forced to testify against his own mom, Marie Antoinette. They are going to force him to testify that she had sexually molested him. And this really hurt Marie Antoinette when she heard it. This kid was separated from his mom and dad. He was locked in a dark chamber in a castle where he was fed barely enough to live off of. He was prevented from seeing any outside visitors. He was even physically abused by his jailers. This is a kid who begins to show signs of instability. And when this begins to happen, no one does anything. And so ultimately, Louis Charles is going to die in jail at the age of 10 from tuberculosis, probably brought on by the mistreatment that he suffered at the hands of his jailers. Interestingly, a very sympathetic surgeon who did the autopsy smuggled the child's heart out of the prison, and that led to a centuries-long trip for the heart, where it was passed from royal relation to royal relation across the continent before finally coming to rest and be buried alongside his parents, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. As for Marie Antoinette's youngest daughter, she was to remain in prison until the age of 17, at which time she was released and sent to her mother's native Austria to live with her family. So Marie Antoinette had some rough edges, but she also had a softer side, and I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that as well. All right, let's take a look at one of these radical organizations that existed during the French Revolution. It's called the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune was established as a city government, basically, in Paris to replace the old government that was loyal to the king. It became the center of very radical politics. It was a driving force in some of the more radical actions taken by the National Convention. The Commune is going to play a key role in several big events, including the storming of the Tuileries Palace, the September massacres, all of these things they are going to be involved in. So the Paris Commune is kind of a cancer at the heart of the revolution. driving it to be more and more radical, more and more violent. Ultimately, the Paris Commune does give us an idea of how grassroots political organizations can act directly. So there are groups out there like today, like Habitat for Humanity. There are climate groups that are out there. These are grassroots, regular people who organize to make political change. The Paris Commune did that. Unfortunately, all the change they were driving was typically very negative. There was a radical journalist by the name of Jean-Paul Marat. He was a physician who played a pivotal role in the French Revolution and was also the editor of a newspaper that advocated for a lot of radical reforms, including the abolition of monarchy. He was kind of the champion or the hero of the sans-culottes, and he used his newspapers a lot to incite the public. He condemned the moderates like the Girondists in the National Convention and felt that they had betrayed the revolution. Unfortunately for Marat, he was actually assassinated by a woman, Charlotte Corday. Charlotte Corday was a witness to all the violence that was taking place in Paris, and she blamed him for driving a lot of that violence through his newspaper. So she came to his house one day, which is not uncommon, and was told that he was in the bathtub, which also was not uncommon. Marat had a skin condition that was very painful and itchy, and the only thing that soothed it was when he would sit in his bathtub full of water with ointment. And so he was known to actually conduct a lot of business from the bathtub. He received visitors while he was in the bathtub. And so Charlotte shows up at his door asking to see him, saying that she has some news that he might find useful in the newspaper. When she's escorted into the room and left there, she immediately takes out a knife, dives at Marat, and stabs him to death. His death is going to further fuel the radical Jacobins, and it's going to lead the moderates to a smaller and smaller role in the revolution, because he becomes a martyr for the cause. He becomes a hero martyr that everybody remembers, and everyone is upset has been killed, and they blame the moderates for having killed him, even though it was the hand of Charlotte Corday that killed him. I mentioned in passing two of the political groups that existed in the French Revolution. One of them was called the Jacobins, the other was called the Girondins. The Jacobins were the radicals. They wanted to abolish monarchy, they wanted to push society towards universal suffrage where men, women, everybody could vote, and they were led by a leader named Maximilien Robespierre. On the other side of the equation, we have the Girondins. The Girondins are a moderate group. They like constitutional monarchy. They like the king being in place, just having his power limited. And the Girondins tended to be popular among the middle class, and they were led by a guy named Georges Danton. Unfortunately, the Girondins, as I said, as the revolution becomes more and more radical, their voice is going to become smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually Georges Danton, the leader of the Girondins, is going to be executed via guillotine for being an enemy of the revolution because he refused to go along with some of the more radical ideas. Ultimately, this conflict will take place in the National Convention, but it's the Jacobins who win this conflict and take control of the National Convention, which is the government legislature during the French Revolution. I told you the Jacobins were led by Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was actually originally a lawyer who had been heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau. He embraced this idea of a republic in France. He believed in a lot of egalitarian or socialist ideas. And ultimately, he's going to be elected to the Estates General after having given some very inspiring speeches about the need to have a French republic. He will grow in status, he will grow in influence, and eventually by 1793, he is the leader of the Jacobins and is becoming a major force in the French Revolution. This guy was a brilliant orator. His speeches were powerful, they were direct, they were mesmerizing, and he often went into groups hostile to his ideas and was able to use the speech that he did to convince them to change their minds. He believed in virtue, he believed in equality, he believed in a French Republic above all else. And he also is going to be someone who served on an organization called the Committee of Public Safety, which we're going to take a look at momentarily. This guy is one of the movers and shakers in the French Revolution as it's becoming more radical. His portion or his part in the revolution is ever evolving right up into through the execution of Louis XVI. Robespierre actually began as a moderate, which is weird. He was against capital punishment. He was only for male suffrage, not for female suffrage, meaning the right to vote. But as the revolution intensified, he felt that virtue and terror were the only things that could save the republic. Robespierre said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible." Here's the problem. Terror is not justice. Terror is the opposite of justice. And Robespierre is looking at the revolution in terms of who agrees with him and his more radical ideas and who is against his ideas. Anyone against his ideas he considers to be an enemy of the revolution, and he believes that it's fair game to terrorize and even execute those people. He justifies the violence against the revolutionary enemies because he believed that violence was temporarily necessary to achieve the goals of the revolution itself. And in a very bold move, he even tries to replace the national religion of Catholicism with a deist cult called the Cult of the Supreme Being. He made that the official state religion. And this is a state religion that focuses on the power of human reason and human accomplishment. And God is really taken out of the equation and replaced by the worship of reason. During his time as the leader of the National Convention, there were several key pieces of legislation that were passed. One of them, and probably the most important, is it is the National Convention, not the Estates General, not the National Assembly, not the Legislative Assembly. It's the National Convention that finally abolishes monarchy and declares France a republic, much like what we have here in the United States. However, he moved beyond that and he created a law that was designed to arrest anyone suspected of opposing the revolution. This could be a rumor started by a neighbor. This could be something one of his enemies, one of the person's enemies, dropped information on. And you could arrest these people with no evidence, with no probable cause, or no reason to justifiably suspect that they are involved in some kind of opposition to the revolution. He also created a revolutionary tribunal, which is a court filled with revolutionary radical judges. People would go before them once they were accused of opposing the revolution. These judges basically found everyone guilty. Nobody was given the right to a lawyer. They weren't given the right to speak for themselves. And they very quickly moved through lines and lines of people who came to court and ordered their execution at the hands of the guillotine. The National Convention did abolish slavery in all the French colonies, although notice they did not abolish any slavery that existed in France. So the Declaration or the National Convention was a mixed bag, but on the whole, its radicalness and its tendency to use violence and suppress the individual rights of the citizens of France is really the hallmark of that organization. Robespierre is going to give birth to the Reign of Terror. This is a period of time between September 1793 and July 1794 where there is extreme violence and mass executions used to systematically target and kill individuals considered enemies of the revolution. Maybe this is clergy, maybe this is nobles, maybe this is farmers in the countryside who are against the increasing violence of the revolution. Maybe this is Catholics who oppose the replacement of their religion with a new state religion based on reason. But anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution or an opponent of the revolution was targeted. Ultimately, in just this short amount of time, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people are going to die at the hands of the revolutionary tribunals and the guillotine. The Reign of Terror really had four major purposes. One is get rid of anyone perceived as an enemy of the revolution. Another one was to instill fear and try to force people to follow the revolutionary values and the state religion because they were afraid that if they didn't, what would happen to them. In essence, they were making examples of people with the guillotine and making it so people were scared to speak out or scared to oppose the revolutionary movement that was occurring. The Reign of Terror was also designed to consolidate power and eliminate all opposition to the Jacobins politically. So any of the political opponents of the Jacobins, including the leader of the moderate Girondins, Georges Danton, were executed as enemies of the revolution because they weren't radical enough. The final objective of the Reign of Terror was simply to defend the Republic against foreign invasion and revolt. Remember, there is still wars brewing. There are coalition armies that are forming, one after the other, in a series of attacks on France from outside by other European countries scared the revolution might spill over to their country. The leading group in the Reign of Terror was called the Committee of Public Safety. Now, if you're like me, you think of public safety, and that's a good thing. You think of the crossing guard at the elementary school wearing the little vest and a bunch of people like that. This Committee of Safety was absolutely nothing like that. It was the governing body of France that controlled the government through the legislature. It was made up of 9 and eventually 12 members selected by the Radical Revolutionary National Convention, and Robespierre emerges as its most influential leader. This committee is going to oversee military strategy, it's going to oversee domestic policy, and it's going to oversee the Reign of Terror. So the Committee of Public Safety has nothing to do with public safety other than they believe they're getting rid of opponents of the revolution, which will make for a safer France in the long run. One of the things the Committee of Public Safety did is instate a draft where people were forced into the military to go fight against these coalition armies that were coming. This mostly impacted the lower tiers of the Third Estate and consequently was very unpopular with the working class in Paris and throughout the country. How do they instill all this fear? Well, they use something called the guillotine, which is a device designed to behead somebody with a weighted blade. You basically suspend the blade on a rope, you pull it up to the top of its track, you stick someone's head through to the neck in that stockade that you see pictured here, the wooden one, and as the person is motionless and cannot move or pull their head back, you drop the razor blade on them, thus cutting off their head. The guillotine was actually invented by a guy named Antoine Louis. However, a popular mythology is that it was invented by a guy named Dr. Guillotine. Regardless, the instrument was designed to be a humanitarian instrument. It was designed to create a quick and merciful death for the person. So we look at the guillotine as like a torture or a torturous way to be killed, but in reality, the people who invented it thought these people are all going to be killed anyway. Rather than risk some other way that might not be foolproof, where the person might survive the attempt to kill them, let's create a quick, merciful death for them by cutting their head off. Interestingly, they say that the brain will still operate for around 20 seconds after the head is cut off a body. So it is conceivable that your head could roll down onto the platform and you would still consciously know and be able to look back at your body, which is headless. This will be the primary execution method in the Reign of Terror, and it really does become a symbol of revolutionary justice, as they called it. This was used against all classes, but primarily against those first and second estate members. There was some opposition to the Reign of Terror, although it was never terribly effective. The moderate revolutionaries tried to blunt the impact of the extremist radicals in the convention, and the people were also upset with the government as the Reign of Terror was unfolding. There were still food shortages, just like there had been under King Louis. There were still economic hardships like unemployment and homelessness, and there's still high bread prices and discontent. So the Parisian sans-culottes, who are a revolutionary group who supported the revolution initially, have become very disenchanted with the government because it's not solving the problems they need it to. We actually see some regional rebellions break out. Those regional rebellions included something called the Vendee Rebellion. The Vendee is an area that was in northwestern France, and the farmers there were very upset about these continued economic conditions. They were upset about the draft into the army. They were upset about the poor economy, and they were upset about the replacement of the Catholic religion. So they have no allegiance really to the revolution at this point. They form their own army, and they rise up against the French government in protest. Unfortunately for them, the National Guard, the People's Army, the Revolutionary Army, is now under the control of the radicals. The army moves into the Vendee region and begins to burn down crops, burn down forests, destroy farms, and kill all the rebels they can get their hands on. By the time it's done, they have killed about 300,000 of these rebels in the Vendee region. What that does is it kind of demonstrates for us the effectiveness of the new Republic government in terms of power, but it also shows us there is resistance to this radical agenda that we keep seeing. So how does this all come to an end? Well, Robespierre goes a step too far. By mid-1794, his extremism and the continuing violence of the Terror have alienated many of his former allies in the conventions. He's starting to look unhinged. First he killed members of the First and Second Estate. Then he killed anyone who was moderate in the Third Estate. And he's running out of people to kill, but he still seems to have this desire to control everything in society, and he sees enemies of the revolution around every corner. And he's becoming increasingly paranoid. There was a festival that was held to introduce the new religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. And at this festival, they built this massive mountain out of paper mache in the middle of Paris. And the National Convention ordered that all cities and villages in France were to celebrate the launch of this new religion on the same day and at the same time. Well, Robespierre was the featured person in the Paris one, and he appears at the very top of the mountain, shrouded in smoke, wearing a white robe with his arms outstretched, And he begins to basically act as if he's a god of some kind. People who saw this at the festival of the Supreme Being, they were freaked out. They're like, what is this guy? What has he become? He used to be moderate, and now he's unhinged. And so people are already starting to doubt his leadership. And as he begins to look for new groups to target, to consider enemies of the revolution, he basically sets on the other members of the National Convention. He gets up and gives a speech in July of 1794 where he basically says, I have a list of enemies of the revolution who sit in this very body, the National Convention, and I will not rest until I have found you and I have taken you out like I've taken out the other enemies of the revolution. At this point, the members of the National Convention themselves, fearing for their lives, fearing for their families' lives, and feeling that Robespierre has literally become unhinged, they are going to get together and arrest him in a coup that becomes known as the Thermidor reaction or the Thermidorian reaction. He is going to be arrested and taken to jail. The jailer says, hey, no way, I'm not having anything to do with that guy. If you put him in my jail, all his supporters are going to overwhelm my guards and we're going to end up dead. We're not doing it. So they refused to accept Robespierre as a prisoner. So what the people did is they took him to the city hall and they took him into the office of the mayor, and the guards threw him in there, and then they shut the door behind him and they stood guard outside the door to this office until they could get word to the National Convention and ask for advice on what do we do with him now. Well, inside, Robespierre, having been declared a national outlaw, a criminal, by the National Convention he used to run, he's become distraught. And he's afraid that if he doesn't do something drastic, that he's going to end up going to the guillotine as well. So he goes and he looks around the room and he finds a pistol hidden in the desk of the mayor. And he takes the pistol out and he tries to kill himself using the pistol. When he shot himself, he managed to blow off the lower half of his face, including his jaw, but he didn't die. The guards outside hear him screaming in agony, and they run into the room and they see this bloody mess of a guy, and he's like, doctor, doctor, yeah, doctor. They look at him and laugh and say, tough luck, you deserve everything you get. Ultimately, they're going to drag him to a jail cell where he will await a quick trial in which he's found guilty of treason against the people of France, and he is going to be marched to the guillotine and executed by the very instrument that he had used to kill so many others. The death of Robespierre, the death of the extremist Jacobin leader, is really the beginning of the end of the French Revolution, and it definitely ended the Reign of Terror. The outcomes of the Reign of Terror? Well, it did radically alter French politics. It made it so the radicals had the voice in the government, and the moderates, who were just believers in constitutional monarchy, were silenced. It had a social impact in that the deaths of all of these people during the Reign of Terror, this affected lots and lots of families. Everyone knew a friend or a relative who had been killed by the government in the Reign of Terror, and so they were anxious to get out of that phase of the revolution and to go back to a more stable society, maybe a more moderate society. Ideologically, it does show us a cautionary tale. It shows us that revolutions that go off the track and that lose sight of their original goal, which was democratic reform and Enlightenment rule, when you lose sight of your purpose and you turn instead to mass violence and mass conscription or drafting, and you turn on the very people who have supported you, that can have massive implications. And then finally, militarily, its mobilization efforts when it drafted people did help France resist the invasion, and ultimately are going to be what keeps France free of external control by a foreign power. A guy named Napoleon might have had a little something to do with that as well. Once the Reign of Terror comes to an end, the National Convention is going to be disbanded, and it's going to be replaced by a new government known as the Directory. The Directory is more of a transitional government. It was looking for ways to stabilize the French and end the Reign of Terror. It was really trying to bring everything back to the norm, which doesn't involve people being killed in mass numbers on the streets of Paris. So the Directory is something that we're going to see eventually give way to Napoleon, and that's a story for another day. But overall, you see the Reign of Terror and the impact it had on the French. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and good luck adding these notes to your accumulated French Revolution notes.